Hola a todos y a todas, buenas tardes. Bienvenidos a esta plática. Vamos a tener ahorita una persona muy importante en el mundo de las ciencias del comportamiento aplicadas, porque tiene una carrera muy importante en el mundo académico, pero también tiene una carrera muy importante en la parte aplicada, que es muchas veces donde esto importa más. Entonces les voy a introducir a Eldar Shafir un poquito para que conozcan su trabajo. Digamos, él nos va a hablar directamente de esto, pero para mí hoy es un honor presentar a Eldar Shafir, que es, como les decía, una figura muy importante en el mundo de las ciencias del comportamiento aplicadas. Él es profesor en Ciencias del Comportamiento y Políticas Públicas en la Universidad de Princeton y también es director del Centro Kahneman-Treisman. Este centro se creó justamente en honor al trabajo pionero de Kahneman y de Treisman, ¿no? Que se dedica a ver cómo aplicar las ciencias del comportamiento aplicadas en el mundo, específicamente hacia política pública, ¿no? Lo importante también es que Eldar, les digo, tiene una carrera muy importante en el mundo aplicado. Él es cofundador y director científico de Díaz 42, que es una de las empresas más importantes en el mundo de aplicación de esta disciplina, especialmente a problemas de desarrollo, ¿no? También formó parte del Consejo Asesor de Capacidad Financiera del presidente Barack Obama, donde pues justamente estuvo encargado de aplicar algunos de estos principios a temas de política pública, ¿no? Él tiene mucha experiencia en investigación y su enfoque práctico lo hace justamente un balance muy interesante. Entonces me da muchísimo gusto y muchísimo honor presentarles a Eldar Shafir.
Gracias, Emiliano. Way too generous, but thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to give an hour presentation. Feel free to interrupt if there's something is unclear, of course, or if I'm speaking too quickly or anything else. So I want to give you a behavioral perspective on people living with insufficient resources. The focus will be on money, but as I will mention later, we think it also applies to people who are poor in time, or poor in social connections, or poor in calories, other applications. But I'll focus on poverty. And I always like to spend 5 minutes giving you a behavioral perspective, just how a behavioral scientist thinks about people. And I don't know how else to start with a series of really classic studies. You may have seen them, they've entered popular culture. I want to give you my rendition of them for 5 minutes. The classic study is one done by Stanley Milgram, who is a scholar. These are in the 70s. These are psychologists who are obsessed with understanding the German mind after the Second World War. We now know, of course, there's nothing German about it. It's the mind all of us have behind the eyes and between the ears, but it wasn't clear then, and that's what I want to tell you. So Milgram does a study where he brings subject to the laboratory. The subject, he wants this. The subject in a black suit meets who he thinks is another subject sitting down in a white shirt. The participants think they're randomly assigned to being either a teacher or a student, but in fact, all the participants will be teachers. They're the ones standing up, and the student who is sitting down, attached to electrodes, is an actor. He's a confederate. He works for the experimenter. And the task is this, and you see the scientist in the white coat working for Yale University introducing them. Then the teacher, the participant, the subject, goes to the other room, and there's a study. It's irrelevant. I teach you paired associates. I teach you house, banana. The teacher says house. The subject, the student is supposed to say banana. If he gets it right, bravo, we move on. If he gets it wrong, you give a slight electric shock. And if he gets it wrong again, you give a slightly higher electric shock. And the participant, the teacher, if he chooses to do so, gives electric shocks that get progressively higher every time the student makes a mistake. Now, this follows a very careful choreographed script. So when you can see the machine, every time I press, the lever stays down. So then I know when to do the next time. And as I progress from 70 to 100 volts, there's grunts. The student, the actor, grunts. And 150 screams, get me out of here, I told you I have heart trouble, which he happens to mention when they meet. If you were to choose to keep going, at 270, when you give 270, there's screams of agony. The original is recorded. You can actually see it on public television. It's available. Screams of agony. And then if you still keep going, it's 330, you say house, and nothing at all comes back, silence. 330, 340, 350, 360, up to 450. You ask 12 or 13 questions and nothing comes back. after the person screamed agony and told you it has heart trouble. That's how it's choreographed. Now, why would anybody do any of this? You saw the distinguished fellow with a white coat working for Yale, looking very confident in what he's doing, and he says, please continue, the experiment requires that you go on. This is a sort of pressure on the participants. You're expected to keep going, that's what the experiment requires. This is kind of a close-up. It's a heavy metal machine. We know that all the participants believe this is for real because they're very unhappy. Milgram, who was a brilliant experimenter, did one more thing that was a very important lesson for us. He asked people to predict what will people do. So he gave them a full rendition of what I've just told you in much more detail, and asked them, please predict what will people do. So we have the data, and we know that in the northeast of the US in the late 70s, everybody predicted disobedience. At about 135 volts, when the grunts get a little bit louder, people predict that people will no longer be willing to continue. Except for the psychiatrists in the northeast of the US in the 70s who recognize that 1 in 1,000 might be a sociopath who goes all the way to 450. The findings are that 65% of participants are sociopaths, and everybody goes above 300. Now, we can spend an hour discussing just this finding. So, number one, this is a true discovery about human behavior. We know that people didn't understand this before. So Milgram, there are letters that he shares with the National Institute of Health, who's funding this research. Milgram's agenda was to find the opposite, to show that the American independent spirit is nothing like the German. He is completely blown away. He expected to find the opposite. He replicates this later in Bennington College in the Northeast, which is one of the bastions of leftist liberalism, anti-Vietnam US. They look just as bad as the men near Yale. He can't get rid of it. And it's something we learned. It's something we learned, and it's something that we can't incorporate into our own self-understanding. So I tell you this, I've told this many times, most of us suspect we wouldn't do it. And most of us are tragically wrong. And it's something that, you know, when you read about Abu Ghraib or some other horrible place where soldiers behave terribly, this tells you these are not horrible people, they're regular people who were put in a horrible situation. And this is really kind of probably the number one lesson in the social sciences, is the situation has an enormous impact, and we tend not to understand, not to get it, not to understand how impactful it is. Now, I will tell you a lot more about the situations of living with not enough, of living in poverty. But in general, when we talk about the importance of a situation, it doesn't have to be, you know, electrocuting people. It's in a classroom, it's in a supermarket, it's how this is built. Everything you do in everyday life, the context has an impact on your psyche. Some, of course, stronger than other, but it's something that we tend to underappreciate. I'm using examples. If you simply take the competition between restaurants, so restaurants everywhere, but I have US data, try to compete, and one way they try to compete is to give you more food. So if you look at this is the plate you get in 1960, and this is 2010. Don't forget it's pi r squared. You get a lot more pasta on the right than on the left. And this is just, of course, if people were rational agents, the way we think about economic theory, and they walk to the restaurant planning to eat, 4.7 calories, it doesn't matter what you give them, they'll eat and they'll stop. But of course, we know that's not what happens. People, you put in front of them, we have an interesting conversation, and I eat what's on my plate. And as a result, there's a real issue. This is the CDC, it's very official. Literally, when you have a hamburger, an average hamburger in the United States today, you have exactly 3 of grandma's hamburgers. So every lunch you have 3 of grandma's lunches, just because that's what's on the table. And so people are worried a lot about, there's many examples like these, I'll give you a few more, but nuanced and contextual design, and many people here are doing design, this is very relevant, will impact people's behavior in ways that we fail to appreciate. And some of it can be beneficial, a lot of it can be less good. But going back to low-income people for a moment, if you look at the literature on low-income people, they behave badly everywhere you look. If you look at the world of health, we have solved a lot of diseases today. There's just, you only have to do is take your medication. There's adherence problems. People fail to take the medication on time. And there's lots of studies that the poor are less good at adhering to the medication than the rich, even if you control for access, liquidity, and everything else. They behave less consistently, they're less abiding to the medication. If you move all the way to the world of weeding, farmers in India, low-income farmers weed less than their rich neighbors. And weeding is a low-skill activity that simply gives you a higher income. There's a lot of work in parenting where poor parents are less consistent, less attentive, less disciplined, less patient, etc. And in finance, there's an enormous amount of work on how bad financial decisions are made by the poor. So this is a classic situation that you see all the time. There's a lot of work on why this might be, and I'm putting this here to say I'm not dismissing all of this. A lot of this is probably right. There's neighborhood effects, there's peer effects, there's other things, education. But what I'm going to do for the next half hour is focus just on one thing, which is basically the psychology that emerges when you're living in poverty and the impact that has on behavior. And my point is going to be that psychology that emerges in context of poverty is true for anybody who is in context of poverty. There's nothing special, and that's what I'll try to convince you. A lot of it is in the book that we wrote about exactly this. And the story, to give you kind of the summary of the message, is that contexts of poverty, of scarcity, produce their own psychology. In particular, you're spending enormous amount of your cognitive resources, of your attentional resources, juggling this insufficient resource. You have to worry about food for Monday and rent for Friday, and you're busy doing all of that. And when you're busy juggling insufficient resources, there's just less mind left for other things. And when you're not paying attention to other things in context of scarcity, bad things happen. That's going to be the story, roughly. And contexts of scarcity are profoundly problematic. So this is some of the issues that describe somebody living in context of poverty. I keep putting no money because there is a certain intersectionality here. It's not just that it's noisy in the neighborhood, but you don't have enough money to install soundproof windows. It's not just that it's unsafe, but you cannot afford gates and locks. So it's a really compounded set of challenges that are very extreme. And one thing that you discover, it cannot be easily helped, it's complicated, but one thing you discover is that if you look at experts, we tend to specialize. Some of us work on nutrition, some of us work on education, some of us work on housing. And except for places maybe here where different disciplines interact, it's very compartmentalized. And there is a beautiful metaphor from a feminist writer by the name of Jennifer Fry, who I recommend in any case. But she says, consider the bird cage. If you look very closely, just one wire in the cage, you cannot see the other wires. If your conception of what is before you is determined by the myopic focus, you could look at that one wire up and down, the length of it, and be unable to see why the bird would just not fly around the wire. And so what you find very often, people work on one thing and they think, if only I solve the issue of food, they'll do better. If only I solve the issue of housing, they'll do better. But the challenge here is complicated because of this. It's not just one grill, it's the whole cage. And things interact in ways that make the problem very difficult from a behavioral perspective. One reason it's so difficult is because the challenges are extreme. And what you find is, and I want to just make two brief comments. One is, when you study poverty, especially in the US, there's a very common question that somebody says, when you describe the poor in the US, maybe even in Mexico, what do you mean poor? If you put them in New Delhi, they'd be middle class. It's not that bad. And so I want to address that because it's important. This is a classic thing that every 10 years comes out in the US. It usually comes from a slightly resentful right wing that wants to stop giving benefits to the poor. But what they tell you is how good do the poor have it. So look at the poor in America, 91% have colored TVs, as if you could buy black and white if you wanted to, and all kinds of other things, how good they have it. And every time they publish one of these, people read them and they're left with the impression that, things are not bad. The most recent one was in 2011, a big thing about how, the poor in America have air conditioning and cable TV. Again, it was published. People read it. Nobody said anything, except for the true commentators in the American scene. I don't know if you know these guys, but Steve Colbert is a classic comedian. And he says, this report proves the poor are just not living down to our expectations. If you still have the strength to brush the flies off your eyeballs, you're not really poor. It's a very vulgar way of saying pretty much what the Heritage Foundation means. Stop bothering us, they're not so bad. John Stewart says, I've never realized they had it so good. No wonder the middle class is pouring into their ranks in droves. And the reason this is important is because 400 years earlier, Adam Smith solves this completely. He says, look, it used to be the case that you were not expected to wear a linen shirt to work if you're a British laborer. Now that you're expected to wear one, if you can't afford it, you're poor. So I'm saying all this to tell you, when I'm going to talk about the poor in the US, in Mexico, in Denmark for that matter, if you're not able to live the minimally acceptable life in the place and time in which you live, you're poor. Now, of course, it's true that things have changed. 100 years ago, people didn't have running water. But you can't go to somebody and say, now that you have water in the faucet, stop complaining. Things have changed. And so today, even if you don't have internet access, and your kid cannot do her homework through the internet, in some sense, you're entering a situation where you might be poor. So again, I want to talk about the poor in the US and Mexico and other places, people who simply cannot afford to live the minimally acceptable life in which they live. And this is important. So in the US, for example, right now, the US is very proud of the fact that the poverty has gone down from 13 to 11%. And the poverty rate in the US is calculated by a poverty line. There's a number. And if you're below it, you're poor. Above it, you're rich. You're not poor. And I want to give you an example. So this is a woman who lives in Charlotte, North Carolina with 2 children. Her annual income is about $7,500, which, according to the poverty line for a family of 3 in North Carolina, makes her officially poor. So the US gives her some meager benefits. She gets food stamps, nutritional supplements, all things that are given to single mothers, etc. And she ends up with $18,800, which is more than $17,400, and she no longer counts as poor. This is the poverty line. Now, there are many organizations in the US that compute the living wage. The living wage is not the poverty line. That's a number that's a result of some calculations that were made in the 60s. But it's the wage that these organizations compute is the minimum you have to live a minimally acceptable life. In a place where Angelique with the 2 children live, the living wage is $34,000. So although now with 18 she no longer counts as poor, she's nowhere close to being able to live a minimally acceptable life. Okay? And I'm saying this to you because when I talk about the psychology of not having enough, she's definitely in it. In fact, if you look at the living wage as a metric, somewhere between 120 and 150 million Americans fit this description. So I'm saying all this, when I describe to you studies about the poor, I don't want you to think about, a homeless person in the corner. It's between a third and half of America. It's people in this room, it's people in my classrooms, it's people who are your friends. Of course, people come and go. They may have been and no longer, but this is a completely standard description of somewhere around the half the population. In Mexico, the numbers are a bit different. In Mexico, 36% are in poverty and about 10% are in extreme poverty, which makes it close to 50%. Mexico has a very sophisticated way of calculating, actually. It's not just your income. It's your income plus being in one of 6 categories of social sufficiency that computes that make you poor. So it's actually a much more sophisticated version. You have to basically be sort of below the línea de bienestar económico, plus something else. But in any case, it's half the population, más o menos. Now, when we describe this in our book, one metaphor we use for the challenges of juggling insufficient resources is a suitcase, and people tend to remember it. So basically, imagine going through life where your budget is a suitcase. Some of us travel with a large suitcase, some of us have a very small suitcase. Imagine yourself packing for a weekend in Paris. You throw your big suitcase on the bed, you throw a few things in. You're not going to take everything that's in the house, so you throw things in, let's assume by decreasing order of importance. And after you threw 12 or 15 things, you're ready. You didn't have to focus very much because the suitcase is big. You leave some space for things you forgot. You close the suitcase, you're ready. Now imagine the exact same thing with a very small suitcase. You start throwing things in. By thing 4 or 5, you're running out of space. You have to stop doing, you cannot talk on the phone anymore. You have to focus on your packing. You have to pay attention. You become an expert on what takes more room in the suitcase, the boots or the coat. You're in a challenging situation. And when you close the suitcase, there's no slack. There's no space left in case you made a mistake or if you want to pick something up on the way. Okay, it's much more tight. That's in some sense what you see when you talk about people going through life with slack, with sufficient resources and some space for making errors, and those who are very, very tight. And so if you think of somebody who's packing a very tight suitcase, they're going to become experts on the size of things, how much things cost, what they mean. And there's a lot of work in marketing that shows this. The top one, if you still simply, this is not our work, it's marketers have done this for years. If you simply stand outside of a supermarket and ask people for the receipt when they come out, and ask them, how much did you pay for the pasta? How much did you pay for the enchiladas, anything else? And you check the household income, the poor know exactly how much they paid and the rich have no clue. Okay, because they have slack in their suitcase, it doesn't matter. They bought the luxury not to care. A lot of work in trade-offs. Trade-offs are interesting. All of us know people who, when they buy a book or a record or have lunch or buy a coffee, don't ask themselves, what will I not buy instead? You buy a coffee, it's as if nothing. But in standard economic thinking, everything has a trade-off. The person who sells you the coffee very often will ask herself, if I have a $3 cappuccino, what will I not buy instead? And you find if you interview people, of course, if you buy a Ferrari, you might ask, what do I not buy instead? But everyday stuff, lunches, coffees, you don't bother, where somebody else thinks about trade-offs all the time. We ran one very fun study in Boston. We stood outside South Station, the train station in Boston. We got people's reported household income, and we asked them, when you go into a taxi in Boston, what does the meter read in the taxi? What does it start from? And it's a great study because the rich take taxis and the poor don't, and the poor know the meter much better than the rich. And so this is the image I want to leave you with. The rich person enters the taxi in Boston and sits back and looks at the Charles River and the sunshine. It's very beautiful. The poor is staring at the meter. That's the psychology that we're getting. And there's tons of data about the juggling challenges of living in poverty. Something happens all the time. You're busy juggling all the time. And again, some of it are urgent. There's not enough food. You're facing eviction. You can't pay tuition. Things happen, and the way we talk about it is when important things happen, you tunnel. You tunnel on the thing that's urgent, which happens a lot. And when you're tunneling on the thing that's urgent, other things that you know are important in the periphery are left for another time, they're ignored. And that's very complicated, especially in a context of relative cruel world facing poverty. Now, and a critical part of this, and this probably is relevant to many people in this room, is that people have very limited bandwidth. The reason I'm telling you that it's so important that the poor are focusing is we don't have enough attention for everything. When you focus, think about it this way, you're driving through a massive storm, terrible rain in the car, you stare 4 meters ahead of you. You don't pay attention to the ads, you don't pay attention to the parks, you're staring ahead. That's all the bandwidth you have. And there's amazing studies on bandwidth. The top left, if you simply put people in a simulator and they're talking on the phone while driving, no hands held, the hands are irrelevant. You're on the phone while driving, people's ability to detect the periphery and the reaction time are equivalent to somebody who's legally drunk in the US. These are simulator studies. There's an amazing study we describe on the top right. This is a classroom in Connecticut where by random assignment, half the class, these are first graders, is in the quiet side of the room, and the other half are near train tracks. So throughout the day, out the window, a train goes by. Now, are trains distracting? Yes, they're distracting. How distracting are they? They found that in 5th grade, in the 5th year, the kids near the train tracks are 1 year behind in academic performance. It's a massive effect. They install soundproofing, the kids catch up, etc. And again, the thought experiment I want to give you is, imagine you're in a very quiet room, no trains outside. You're trying to do something, and you're facing eviction on Monday. You're trying to do something and you don't have dinner for tonight for the kids. You're trying to do something. These are internal trains. And those internal trains make it very hard for you to focus and think through things. They're internal challenges. Okay, so that's the story we're going to tell about scarcity. And again, it doesn't only have to be about money. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but in some sense, some of you in this room are time poor in ways that are quite reminiscent of the way that our participants are money poor. If I ask you, do you want to go to the movies? You say, what's the movie? And then you think, what will I not be able to do tonight that I have to do tomorrow? You're in trade-off thinking mode. Temptations, the poor have to resist buying expensive coffees or fancy shirts. Paradoxically, in the Western world today, the very successful sometimes cannot afford to spend time with their children. It's become a luxury because you're too busy and the boss expects that email. Okay, so those are ways in which time poverty starts resembling money poverty. And more generally, of course, every mistake counts a lot more. If you pay an unexpected parking meter and you're rich, it's annoying for 1 minute. If you're paying an unexpected parking meter and you're poor, your week changes. Same when you're busy. If you forgot something and you're busy, it's a big challenge. If you forgot something and you're on vacation, okay, you waste an hour. A big difference. We described one study that's quite remarkable. So this is about being poor in calories. In 1942-43, when the Allied forces realized they're going to inherit a lot of starving people in camps in Europe, they realized they also don't know how to feed them. Feeding the starving, it's like coming down from mountain climbing. It's an art of itself. So they hired a US leading nutritionist, Ansel Keys, to study how to feed the starving. To do that, he needed to starve people. He got conscientious objectors, young men who were conscientious objectors to the good war and were delighted to volunteer, and he starved them, not to death, but to massive discomfort. So in these studies, they describe the physical discomfort. These men, young and healthy, cannot keep their arms above their heads long enough to wash their hair. They need pillows to sit down. There's no padding left. It's very touching. But we looked at the mental stuff. These are guys who are hungry. The last thing they want to do is think about food, and it's all they think about. It's actually tragicomic. They memorize recipes. They plan to open restaurants. All they're doing is about food. There's a description they describe where the experimenters feel bad for them. They show them a movie, and the guy said, they showed us a movie. I couldn't care less about the love scenes. I wanted to see the meals. That's all they care about. And so this is part of the story in some sense, that your bandwidth, your capacity is entirely devoted to this thing you don't have enough of, both in terms of what you choose to do and things that just happen automatically. Just that's where your mind goes. Are you getting a very annoying blink? Okay. This is for me to remind you, your brain is doing stuff not under your control. So I love this one. So you get this blink. This blink is 300 milliseconds, which is exactly how long you get darkness every time you blink. Now you blink 15 times a minute. If you're awake 12 hours, and most of you are awake longer, you get 1 hour of darkness every day in front of you right now that you've never seen. That's your brain doing its work. And your brain does a lot of work. Some of it is terrific. I don't see blinks. Some of it is less good. And so when we teach cognitive and we teach all this stuff, you really have to explain to students, yes, you're the owner of the brain, but it's doing its own thing. And this is one of those things where under scarcity, the brain is paying attention in ways that you cannot always control. A classic study is you simply ask participants to come to a lab. Half of them are just invited to come, and the other half are asked not to have any water for 4 hours. So they come very thirsty. They come in, and half of them are given water, and the other half are given pretzels, which is not a good idea when you're very thirsty. And then you give them a word identification task. You just have to identify the words as fast as you can. And what you find is that the thirst-related words are identified by the thirsty people much faster than by those who are satiated, but those who are not thirsty, compared to control words which are identified in the same speed. So you can literally show that thirst-related words are salient in my semantic network. These are 200-300 millisecond responses. They're literally activated in my brain when I'm thirsty in ways that other words are not. My brain is just doing its own thing. Now, we did a bunch of studies. I'll just describe to you a couple. This is in a mall in New Jersey. We ask people to participate, we pay them, they sit in front of a computer, they get scenarios that describe everyday problems, like your car breaks down and it's going to cost a certain amount of money to fix. And these scenarios come in two versions. The manageable case, the car costs $150 to fix, which we know from most people in the mall is doable. The challenging case, the car is going to cost $1,500 to fix, which we know from many people in the mall is a big problem. Okay, so you get one of these two, and you're asked, how will you go about taking care of this problem? And while you're thinking about it, we'll let you play some games to make it interesting. And these games are classic cognitive tests. The one on the left, you basically have to press the same side if you see a heart, and the opposite side if you see a flower. It's a divided attention task. It's basically a driving test. You have divided attention. The one on the right, all of you have taken this before, some version of it. It's the classic fluid intelligence component test of the IQ test. It's the closest we ever come, the one on the right. It's the closest we've ever come to a test that doesn't distinguish between somebody who has very little education and a Nobel laureate PhD. There is a difference, but it's the closest we've come. So you get either the attention test or the IQ fluid intelligence test, and then we look at how you do, and we divided the respondents by income we divide them into the top third of income. So we have the rich and the poor. And then let's see how they do, and all of this will become clearer. If we look at the cognitive control, the driving test, the attention test, this is how the rich do when they're thinking about the challenging car or the manageable car. Either way, they can do it. They're not worried. They perform equally well in both cases. When you look at the poor people in the mall, when you give them the $150 car, the manageable case, they look just like the rich friends. That's it. When you give them the challenging case, where they're worried about how to manage this complicated situation where the car is going to cost a lot to fix, they drive less well. They perform less well in the divided attention test. Okay, their attention is elsewhere. Similarly, for the Raven's matrices, the fluid intelligence, the rich don't care which car they're fixing. The poor are statistically the same as the rich when they fix the manageable car, and they're a lot less intelligent, so to speak, while they're worried about the challenging car. This effect, it's close to a standard deviation. If you make simple assumptions about the distribution of the IQ test, it's like they lost 13 points of the IQ test. 13 points in high school where my girls went to school in Princeton is enough to take you from average to borderline gifted or from average to borderline deficient. It's a big effect. And these are people who 5 minutes ago were just as good as their rich friends. Now when they're worried about a challenging case, they're performing less intelligently, so to speak. Now, the poor and the rich in America, we've tried to control for everything, but they're not the same. Different diets, different education. So the dream was, how do we have the same person do both? It's not easy to get a person to be both rich and poor. But we ended up going to outside of Chennai in India, where sugarcane farmers basically sell their entire, what they collected for the year in one shot. So these are people for whom 70% of the income literally comes in one day. And because they failed to smooth, they ran out of it too soon, these are guys who are fairly rich after harvest and fairly poor before. So we run them with handheld devices, very similar to what the people in New Jersey did, with handheld devices on the field 2 months before and 2 months after harvest. This is now the same people, same education, same everything. And I won't go into the details, but they perform about 9 IQ points less well during scarcity than during plenty. Their minds are loaded. How are we with time? What are we aiming to finish at? Okay. Okay, I'll do this quickly. Payday loans are a big story in America. I actually didn't look up what it's like here. I assume it's a big problem here too. Payday loans are loans given for short term for people who are running out of money. You have to be working. It's a payday loan. You literally give a check based on your next pay stub, but you're running out of money too quickly. You need a few dollars to finish the month. So you go to a payday lender, they give you $200 and you pay them back $240 in 2 weeks. Now, $200 and $240 doesn't look like a big deal. The implied annual interest could be 600, 800%. And if I didn't have $200 to finish this month, how am I going to have $240 to pay you back next month? So if you look at payday lending in the US, which is a gigantic industry, it brings a lot of money, what you find is that people who take a payday loan take on average between 10 and 15 payday loans a year because they take one to pay back the previous one. Last time I saw, I don't know how it is exactly now, last time I saw, if you took a random payday loan given in the US today, then 70% of it went to pay back the previous loan. So you turn people into money pumps at very high interest. It's a terrible move. It looks very myopic. Why ever would you take this loan if you're not going to be able to pay back more next month? And so the poor have been criticized for a very long time for taking these loans, which look stupid because you're not going to have enough money to pay back next month more. And so the question, why are people doing this? This is the most satisfying study I've ever run. We did this with Princeton students. You can't make them poor in money, but we made them poor in time. And Princeton students, I don't know how much you know about this, but they're not your candidate for a myopic, inattentive, uneducated person. If they got to Princeton, they're very, very careful. They plan, they're careful, they're educated, they're good. Okay, so we'll let them play this game. And this is a family feud. They love this game. You have to answer these questions. They get really into it. They get paid according to how well they do, so they really want to do well. And the way we do it is half of them by random assignment are made rich in time. They have 50 seconds every round, which is a lot. And the other half for random assignment are poor in time. They only have 20 seconds, which is 15 seconds, which is not enough. In addition, one group cannot borrow. So every time you run out of time, you move to the next round. The other half can borrow at predatory lending rates, like a payday loan. If you want 2 more seconds, feel free, but you lose 4 seconds from your bucket of time you have. So you're paying 100% interest. Anyway, I'm going to run through this a bit quickly, but okay. If you look at, these are 2 different measures, but if you look at the points they earn or how many rounds they complete, basically how much money they leave with, the rich do better than the poor. Obviously, these are students, but they have a lot more time. If we had more time, I would convince you the rich should be doing a lot better than the poor. And what we discover is that the poor are very attentive because they don't have much time. And the rich, like all of us on vacation, are sort of half paying attention. They're being careless. They're much less efficient. So they do better, but only a little bit better. Okay. So this is when they cannot borrow. Now let's let you borrow. If you'd like, you can take a few extra seconds for high predatory lending rate. You pay high interest. The rich don't care. They have enough time. They're not interested in paying their loans, so they don't take it, and the performance is the same. The poor, remember, the poor are the same Princeton students. I just gave them less time. They're sure they know the answer to number 3. They just need 2 more seconds urgently. They grab 2 seconds, they pay 4 seconds, and they leave the experiment with a lot less money. Now, the reason this makes me so happy is this is very clear. Myopia is not something that's about the poor. It's about anybody who you put in a situation where they need something urgently. Okay, it's just the context of not having enough that makes you take something urgently. If you're on a thought experiment, you come home and there's a fire in the bedroom and there's a bucket of water by the door, which is exactly what a payday loan is. Do you stop and say, excuse me, how much is the bucket? You just grab it and you pour the water on the fire. That's what you get when the poor take payday loans. And that leads to a whole complicated discussion. We can talk about it an hour later about the obligation that governments have to regulate the landmines that are left for the poor in the form of payday loans that we know they will take and will destroy them. Okay? Of course, the standard rational economic theory says you're rational, you should plan carefully, all that. What we're seeing here, it's got nothing to do with it. If you have fire in the bedroom, you grab the bucket. If you have an emergency, you grab a loan that's too expensive and you pay the price. We can talk about other cases. I told you earlier, there's a lot of work on how the poor are less consistent parents, less attentive parents. This just says air traffic control. Sociologists did a giant study where basically they sat in the living room of air traffic controllers for months. Air traffic control is a good example because you have good days and bad days largely determined by random events of weather and traffic. And what they find is that the air traffic controllers are much more attentive parents and much more attentive spouses on easy than on difficult days. Again, what makes people attentive and negligent is being in a context where you don't have enough. Nothing to do with the poor other than the context we put you in. And that has a lot of policy implications. And this is where I think some of you might do work that's not irrelevant, because if my behavior is a function of context, how you design the context makes an effect on what has an enormous effect on what I do. If you leave loans that are too expensive, I'll take them. If you give me loans that are less hurtful, I'll take those. There's a lot of work on how you can nudge people. That's one of the terms that's used. You can design situations that are more or less beneficial. And some of them are, a lot of it, by the way, I don't want to suggest there's malice. There's, of course, malice out there. But a lot of this is very naive. People just don't think about it. The classic example I'll give you from US policy. When Bill Clinton was president, he introduced changes to the welfare system. And the welfare law during Clinton said that if you're a welfare recipient, you're allowed 2 years of welfare receipt total. 5 years of welfare receipt total. After 5 years, you'll run out of welfare payments. Now, think of yourself in a tunnel. There is food for Monday, eviction on Wednesday, you're busy, and somebody tells you in 5 years you'll run out of money. Imagine if I said to you, this was a lovely meeting. If you don't mind, send me a paragraph in 5 years. You know, you're busy, life is full. In 4 years and 11 months, in 3 weeks, you say, oh yeah, the jerk wanted a paragraph, and you send something. When you told the American poor this 5 years, and they're busy on the urgent stuff, after 4.5 years, some of them woke up and said, oh my God, I'm running out of welfare payments. It was a terribly designed system. What Clinton should have done, if he insisted on the 5 years, is make sure either 10 half years or send you reminders into your tunnel and say, don't forget while you're busy on lunch and eviction that you also have this issue, but not just leave it dormant, because what happened is Americans didn't pay attention. So there's a lot of examples like this. You can design contexts that are less or more beneficial. This is one of my favorite pictures, but basically what you're seeing here, there is a tension between intention and action. I intend to save for retirement, I intend to diet, I intend to exercise, and either you design a situation that compels me to do it, or design a situation where it doesn't happen. Retirement savings, by the way, is a giant challenge. All of you are interested because we don't know how to do it, and people who had enough to save hiring way poorer than they should have been, and it's a classic case. And if you're in advertising, or if you're doing behavior change, because of the limited bandwidth, if you talk about influence, how we influence people, there's of course a lot of work on it, but being simple, there is a continuum. I can either get to you through your central processor, meaning you stop everything you're doing, you listen to me, I explain to you, and I try to convince you, or I get to you peripherally. You're not paying any attention. I put a Coca-Cola picture on the wall, and you have the urge to have a Coke. You don't know why, you don't know where. I got you peripherally. These are two ways of getting to people. And the question is, what picture do you put on the wall to give people the desire, the urge to save for retirement? Nobody knows. If you can find one, you'll change humanity. Right now, if you look at messages to save for retirement, they look like this. Okay, so basically, if I want to convince you to save for retirement, you have to stop doing everything you're doing and get a little master's degree in finance to understand what to do. Now compare that to if I want to convince you to smoke. If I want to convince you to smoke, I'm not going to give you all these arguments. I know you don't know, you don't want. What I want to do is catch you when you're distracted, and I'm going to get you peripherally. I'm going to show you pictures of beautiful people and Italian villas. You know, if in the US, a couple of guns sometimes are a good thing, and next, people have the urge to smoke. Very different ways of getting to people. And that has enormous implications. And peripheral advertising, getting to you peripherally, is a big topic because it's one that low-ball players do all the time. And if you look at government, a lot of well-intentioned governments respect people too much to influence them peripherally. And if you respect people too much not to do this, and the other guys do it, they'll win. I live 10 miles from a town called Trenton. It's a very sad town. There are people who give mortgages that are very reasonable. They sit in little offices with peeling paint and formica tables, and nobody comes. And then there are those who sell ballooning, horrible mortgages, and they come to your house with a teddy bear and a balloon, and guess who sells the mortgages? And this is a real challenge. Peripheral advertising ends up being a big story. This is a letter that we sent. This is a predatory lending South Africa. So this is not quite a bank, it's a lender. People get this letter. Everybody who gets this letter took a loan from this lender before. at least once, an average of 5 times, so they know this lender well. And what we do is we manipulate the interest rate on this loan between 3 and 12 percentage points monthly. It changes of 1/4%. So you might get 3.5, you might get 6 1/4, you might get 11 3/4, anywhere between 3 and 12%. The ongoing rate in this market is higher, so ethically speaking, we're giving everybody a gift, but some are getting a much better gift than others. And we check take up, how many people take the loan. In addition to manipulating the interest rates, we manipulate we do several things. I'll just show you 2 behavioral features. The table that you see is just information, just 4 examples of loans that you can take. That's all it is, information. People hate complicated tables, so others, instead of this complicated table, get a table of just 1 example. I just give you less information. Instead of 4 examples, I give you 1, that's all. On the bottom right, you see a nice dude smiling. Other, by random assignment, get a dudette, and others get no picture at all. Now, we cross all this with the interest rate. So without getting into details, I can say, what impact does changing the picture from a man to a woman have on take-up relative to interest rate? That's the kind of questions we can ask. These are 60,000 homes, all for real. The loan taken is about 1/3 of monthly income. And so what do you find? First, you find that economics is right. When I increase the interest rate, take-up goes down, okay? But when I give you a simpler table, I just make the table simpler, take-up of the loan goes up the equivalent of lowering interest 2.3 percentage points monthly. And when I take the picture of the woman and of the man and change it to a woman, take-up of the loan goes up the equivalent of lowering interest 4.5 percentage points monthly. So what are we seeing? People are paying a lot of money for a picture on a letter they're about to put in the garbage. That's peripheral advertising. There is a reason when you open Vanity Fair, the first 30 pages are beautiful people holding shoes and cologne bottles. I mean, speaking of cheap talk, are you kidding me? They paid millions for it. That's peripheral. And those of you interested in governments don't do it. Either they're afraid of being caught, or they believe it's shaping people the wrong way. And if people who sell this stuff do it and governments don't, governments are going to lose. And so how do we change the picture of the behavioral decision maker in ways that can actually help them? Apropos of this, one reason all this becomes complicated is the image of people in low income is often not a good one. So our interpretation often, like I showed you, the interpretation of things like payday loans are not forgiving. You don't say, what is this person doing that I too in that situation would have done? Instead you say, why aren't they doing something else? And the image, we ran one study, I'll show you, we are fantastic face perceivers. When I show you a face, in about 400 milliseconds, less than half a second, you can decide if you like the person, you can decide how competent they are, you can decide all kinds of stuff. It's amazing. Here's a picture. Now we show people this picture, very high quality picture. Here, this guy's wearing a shirt that independent judges agreed is richer than this shirt. One thing we learned, by the way, in this project, for whatever it's worth, is Hawaiian shirts make you look poor. I don't know why, at least in the US. Okay, this is it. Now, all we ask is how competent is this person? It's the only thing we ask. There's many faces, men, women, black, white, etc. Here's a guy wearing a shirt that independent judges agreed is poorer than these clothes. And again, all we ask is how competent is this person? It's the only question we ask. This is people's judgments of competence if you give them a full second to look at the face, which is like an eternity because we're very good at it. Half a second, this is strange times because of the computer display. Or 70 milliseconds. 70 milliseconds, you barely knew you saw a face. And you make the same judgment if I give you a full second. So this is what you get if you show them the rich face, the rich shirt. If you show the exact same face with the other shirt and ask how competent is this person, the person is significantly less competent. This is, speaking about first impressions, this is less than half a second. 70 milliseconds is enough to decide that this person with these clothes is less competent than that person. And the news just get worse from there. And so this is a real challenge. This is a real challenge for how we interpret and understand what we see. And then comes, what do we do? So I don't want to spend too much time. This is one of the most generous benefits the American government gives to young people. It's paying for college. Take up, it's fantastic. You can afford it, and the government literally gives you $15,000 a year to go to college. Take up is less than we would like it to be. Why might that be? This is the form. I can show you experts of this form, but in addition to asking you to fill it, they also remind you to do this under penalty of perjury. So if you got anything wrong, for all you know, you're going to go to jail, etc. Take up is low. Okay, so that question is, of course, the standard discussion is the poor don't appreciate education. Standard, that's the first impulse that comes to mind. Terribly wrong. Then comes the question, maybe they don't know. If only they knew. So they do a study where the purple is current take-up and matriculation among those who are eligible. And then what they do is they tell you, look, we know everything about you. We know your household income. We know your parents' income. You are entitled to FAFSA. Here is the form. So there's no knowledge anymore. We know that you know. That's the green. No effect whatsoever. Condition number 3. We know everything about you. We know your household income, your parents' income. We know you're entitled to this form. Here's a really nice person who, for a minimum wage, will sit next to you and help you fill out the form. And matriculation in college goes up 25%. This is way cheaper than all the things people have tried to convince people to get educated, which they already know. It's not the issue, it's the form that's scary. What people do is they say, look at this form, I'll put it on a shelf, I'll wait till my sister comes back from the University of Chicago to help me, and then life goes by. And so these are the kinds of intrusions that can make an enormous difference. There's a lot of work on retirement savings. If I simply default you into a different level of savings and you're free to change at any time, people who work in the same company who are defaulted to more savings, we meet every day, we play ping pong together, we go to the water fountain together. 4 years later, I retire with a lot more money than you do. It's a single phone call, the most important decision you'll ever make. That's what happens. And again, you can either say people don't understand, or you create a situation, a nuance that changes everything. In the medical world, this is a capsule cap. This is a cap that complains if you don't open it in time to take a medication. In some cases, like HIV, it's very important you take your medication on time. And when I say complains, this $20 capsule squeaks, then it calls you and sends you an email saying, open me, take your medication. And the estimate is it can take years and years of life expectancy difference. And again, it's instead of saying people don't care or people are not responsible, you just help them. Amazing studies on police summons in New York. In New York, if you cross the street and you get a ticket, if you don't show up, there's a summons for your arrest, which is threatening, interferes with your life, and is very costly for the city. So people had the brilliant idea of making the summons a bit easier to read and sending people around. And that saved tens of thousands of arrest warrants. Until then, the police just said, New Yorkers cross the street and don't care. They care, they just forgot you because they have bigger problems. I don't know if anybody here does financial education. It's one of my peeves. Financial education is a wonderful thing I want to emphasize first. Anybody who does financial education, bravo. But in the US, we spend an enormous amount of money on financial education. Of course, we educate the poor because the rich, who can be completely stupid, nobody knows they're making mistakes, so we look at the poor, and we give them financial education. Hundreds of millions of dollars. People finally did a meta-analysis of over 200. These are 201 different interventions, financial education. And what they find is the following. In these programs, if I give you a test before and then after you do the educational training, you do better. You learned a lot. Now you know what compounding is, you know what interest is, great. But then they look at the impact it has on my life. And after 201 interventions, the average impact on people's lives of these interventions is, it's very rare to find, 0.0. Nothing. And this is important because here is my comparison. Imagine you don't know how to swim. And I take you and I give you swimming 101 for a few months. And I take you to a nice little lake in the park, and you go in and you look great. Now imagine after swimming 101, I take you to a massively stormy sea. You'll drown. When you take the American poor and give them financial education and toss them into massively stormy American banking system, which is unregulated and cruel, they drown. And what they know makes no difference. And if that's true, all the wonderful programs in the US spending all the money on the poor are wasting their time. They should just read books to their children instead, because it has no impact on their lives. And it's that sort of thinking about the context mattering much more than my intentions and my understanding that's very hard to grapple. In the book, we discuss basically how policymakers and designers and others are in the business of creating a cockpit that lets people soar rather than crash. And if you look at the cockpits, many in our societies, have very faulty cockpits. And if you make the cockpit difficult with impossible forms and payday loans and condescending attitudes, I crash. And that, in some sense, is the main lesson, I think, from looking at the impact of context. Do we have 5 more? Or should I stop? Okay, so this is a 100-year-old quote from a head of the American Economic Association at the time. He says the economist, but you could put policy analyst, lawyer, taxi driver, teacher, designer, doesn't matter who. If your profession depends on human behavior, either you make it up on human behavior. Okay, either you make out your own psychology or you understand human psychology, and if you make it own, it's going to be bad psychology. And part of what I'm saying here is if you look at policies out there, a lot of them are bad psychology, like trying to understand payday loans or educating people. And I have a big collection, I'll give you just a couple. This is a 2-tier welfare law. For many years in the US, if you were a welfare recipient who moved from state A to state B, and state B paid higher welfare payments, for the first year of residence, you're only entitled to state A level payments. Okay, so if you move to a higher paying state, for the first year you didn't get those payments, you got the lower payments from your original state. You can see where this comes from. These are these guys who are sitting in the basement in Washington, D.C. and saying, if we're not careful, all the poor will get up and they hop in their Jeeps and take their children and go to the higher paying state, and we have to be careful. Ridiculous. What's remarkable about this example is when they came up with these laws, there was data available. And the data showed that mobility from lower to higher paying states equaled mobility from higher to lower paying states. People didn't move because they paid a little bit more. They moved because they found a babysitter, because they found an apartment, they found a sister who can help with childcare. That's why people moved. Half of them didn't even know how much you pay. If you make the rules based on this assumption that people move for money and do this, what happens? What happens is, this is in $1993, just that's what I had data for. In $1993, if you're a mother of 2 who moved from Mississippi to California, instead of $565 a month in California, which more or less allowed you to survive, you would get $120, which guaranteed. Okay, so this is a policy based on the psychology that people move for payments. In fact, you have a country of people who move for other reasons, and you've destroyed them. Another example, now we're moving to Ontario, emergency rooms in Ontario. There's homeless people hanging in the emergency rooms. The doctors and the nurses are not happy about this. It's a beautiful example because the doctors and nurses clearly want to help the people, but they say the homeless hanging in the emergency room, we can't have them there all the time. Let's be less nice to them. And so the assumption is, if it's cold and you give you a cup of tea, they're never going to leave. Dr. Redelmeyer, a wonderful doctor and a dear friend, had the insight that it may be more complicated. So they did a randomized controlled trial where half the homeless who came to the emergency room got the standard treatment. The other half got compassionate treatment. They have an intern who was assigned to them, spends time with them, asks them, how can I help you, takes good care of them. And the findings are completely clear. Those who got the compassionate treatment are significantly less likely to come back to this or any other hospital in the province. And it turns out that the homeless come from non-life-threatening ailments. Their shoulder hurts, their knee hurts. If you treat them not nicely, they come again. If you convince them you did the best you could for them, they're not interested in coming back to the emergency room. So these doctors and nurses, by being obnoxious, kept the problem going, whereas being nice, which is what they always wanted to do, would have solved it completely. That's bad psychology. Last one, and then I'll stop. Bill Bartman, an amazing guy. There's a case about this, by the way, in the Harvard Business School now. there's a TV interview. It's a very colorful man who passed away in a botched operation a few years ago. He went into the debt collecting business. Debt collection is a horrible thing. If you're poor in America, debt collectors threaten you, call you, chase you. People stop answering the phone. It's actually dangerous. He bought people's debt, and the first thing he did is he would send you a little pebble called hope and said, I just bought your debt. I want you to know I will never, ever chase you, never, ever take you to court. I just want you to know I'll do all I can to help you so you can pay some of it back because that's what my livelihood depends on. What can I do to help you? And he had a battery. I visited this in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I had a battery of people on the phone talking to the people who would talk to them who owed him money. So you'd call from Florida and say, I have a leaking roof. And they would find a non-for-profit in Florida who would come and fix your roof. And guess what? These people paid him back their debt much more than anybody else because he was fixing the roofs and taking care of the retirement for their father. And so this guy, by being super nice and not scared, actually claimed, this is the case, to collect a lot more of the debt than all those mafiosis running around threatening them. Again, just the wrong psychology. People are dying to pay back if they can, and if you make it possible, they'll do it. Okay, I'm going to stop, and I don't know if we have time for questions, but that's the message. Okay, good. Okay, let's stop now. Okay. I'm here, so I don't know if you have to leave or go, but I take any questions. So.
What do you think about the social awareness that they put into the poor people and the rich people, that they believe in size so different, and so yeah, the difference between us and what is the dictionary we need to do?
I mean, I don't know how to solve it. You get the question. I mean, you know, I think we don't understand each other in many different dimensions, not just rich and poor. It's true on race, religion, socioeconomic status, nationality, etc. And it's very complicated. So a few studies that have tried to contact hypothesis have been quite disappointing. So a few studies have tried, you know, so Robert Putnam, a sociologist, has a book about this. Giant study that the Rockefeller Foundation funded about having right and left and rich and poor interact more in black and white. And it doesn't make people necessarily love each other anymore. So it's a very tricky, very complicated situation. You know, I have theories about this, and it goes back to some of the stuff we talked about. If you have a theory about somebody, you interpret what they do according to your theory. You don't learn that your theory is wrong. And so it's very hard to revise your theory, even if you see evidence that's contradictory. So it's very tricky. It's a big challenge. Having said that, you know, I think if you go through not just mere exposure, but the educational system and the messages people give, all that can make a difference, but it's a big challenge.
And the companies that work with social impact?
Again, I mean, there's a lot of work on diversity and equality and DEI in many universities. The intentions are terrific. The findings are typically disappointing. But a lot of it is very piecemeal. You know, you try one thing, you try another. If you go back to the cage, you have to attack it from all directions. If you just do one program, the rest of the time, everything is. We did a study in the soup kitchen in Trenton where we tried to affirm people. Low-income people just feel down. So we do an affirmation manipulation where we basically ask them to describe something that made them feel capable and proud. And we show that after we do this, the chance you will take pamphlets as you leave the soup kitchen for benefits and other programs is much higher than if we didn't affirm you. So that's great. But, you know, the minute you take the pamphlet and leave the soup kitchen to the street, you meet America again. And it's all over. So you need something that persists and that's, you know, multidimensional. It's not, people have tried it, but it's very tricky.
Can you give us an example of the affirmation? Just curious.
So the classic we do is literally that you sit in a soup kitchen, we ask you with a tape, please spend a minute describing a situation recently that made you feel capable or proud. And people say, recently I helped a friend, I did this, I did that. Have a meal. On the way out of the soup kitchen, we'll leave pamphlets for many of the benefits that I listed in the Ajuli case, things you can get from the government where take-up is not high enough. That requires some attention, courage to go and apply. Because people in the soup kitchen are usually very down. And the tendency to take the package is 3 times higher among those who just described feeling capable and proud relative to the controls. But again, I think that a minute later, unless you persist, it's not going to happen. People have done affirmation meditations with students and other places. You make them feel better and more likely to make an effort to do the assignment. Those who are not feeling well to begin with, you affirm them.
When you were talking about parenting, can you talk a little bit about these differences in parenting? You mentioned there as well, but any other findings of parenting between the different income levels?
I don't read those books because I don't believe in them. But there's a lot of data that if you look at, for example, consistency in disciplining, I know that's one rubric. They claim that low-income people are much less consistent, whereas those who are high income are more consistent. Certainly attention. Where is your kid now? What are they doing? The claim is that either me or the nanny, somebody close to the kid was because I'm working 3 jobs. And a lot of stuff. There's tons of books. I'm not going to talk about it because I think it's all ridiculous. But the fact that the observations are that the poor are just less attentive and less consistent. Yeah.
Yeah. When you talk about the attentive and the bandwidth and the tunnel vision and everything, in a couple of examples you mentioned time. Like it seems not just on one thing; it's also on the immediate thing. Like I cannot imagine something in 5 years, or I cannot.
That's right.
Can you talk a little bit more about the relationship with time and?
Yeah, so let's take an example of time. Imagine that you have, so here's a classic study that you do. I'll start with that. If I ask this half of the room, please don't forget 2 digits. Please don't forget 17. Okay? Got it? And I ask this half, please don't forget 7 digits. Please don't forget 1725634. Big difference. They're not going to forget to feed the puppy. They're going to forget their mother's birthday. They're going to be completely overwhelmed rehearsing this digit. Their head is full. Well, you guys totally fine. You'll eat more healthier than they will. You'll remember things. And so in some sense, and it's the argument is that when you're juggling insufficient resources, you're walking around with 5 digits because you're constantly worried about things that are urgent. In your case, the most powerful is probably time. So imagine that you have a big deadline for tomorrow morning. All of you have done this. You have a 12-page report due tomorrow morning. You've written 2. What happens? The fact that you're here suggests that you managed to do it fairly well. But while you were working on those 10 pages overnight, you forgot to feed the puppy, didn't call your mother, neglected 1,000 other things. That's what happens. And if you live a life, of course, that's